American society illustrates profound psychological and behavioral patterns that drive political decision-making and institutional evolution. Leaders and elites consistently exhibit short-sightedness, prioritizing immediate rewards over long-term consequences for the nation's historic population. This temporal discounting manifests in choices that favor short-term electoral gains, personal status, and economic advantages while disregarding the compounding effects on demographic continuity, social cohesion, and cultural stability. The result is a gradual erosion of the foundational strengths that once defined the republic, replaced by layers of interventions rooted in human psychological frailties rather than prudent stewardship. Moral vanity and self-deception further animate these dynamics. Politicians and influencers engage in grandiose posturing, framing their actions as embodiments of compassion, fairness, and progress. This virtue signaling satisfies deep-seated needs for admiration and moral superiority while masking underlying motivations of power and control. Cognitive dissonance allows elites to maintain public commitments to failing approaches even as private recognition of their unsustainability grows. Successive generations internalize these patterns, creating a self-perpetuating cycle where inherited myths obscure observable realities of decline. Group dynamics and tribal instincts play central roles in America's trajectory. Human beings naturally form attachments to their own people, culture, and homeland. Yet elite ideologies suppress these instincts among the historic majority while accommodating them in others. This inversion produces tensions arising from rapid demographic shifts, reduced social trust, and competing group interests. The psychological interplay of hubris, venality, and naivety among leaders transforms potential stewards into agents of unintended self-undermining, highlighting how individual and collective behaviors shape national outcomes. Short-sightedness, temporal discounting, and generational transmission of error. Leaders in America frequently demonstrate pronounced temporal discounting, valuing immediate benefits far more heavily than distant costs. This psychological bias leads to policies that deliver visible short-term advantages, such as expanded political constituencies or economic inputs, while externalizing long-term burdens onto future generations. The pattern compounds across time as each cohort adopts and amplifies the myopia of its predecessors, transforming manageable challenges into systemic vulnerabilities. Personal and political incentives align to favor quick wins over multi-generational foresight. This discounting interacts with optimism bias, where elites assume positive outcomes from transformative changes despite contrary evidence from human behavior and group differences. The belief that societies can absorb unlimited alterations without erosion of trust or cohesion reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of evolutionary psychology and social capital dynamics. Younger generations inherit not only the structural consequences but also the cognitive frameworks that normalize these errors, perpetuating a low collective awareness of the trajectory toward diminished continuity for the founding population. The transmission of these errors operates through educational and cultural mechanisms that reinforce reverence for past decisions. This creates path dependence, where questioning the wisdom of accumulated choices feels like an attack on foundational legitimacy. In reality, the psychological comfort derived from inherited narratives prevents realistic assessment and correction. America's experience reveals how temporal discounting, once embedded, becomes a self-reinforcing feature of elite behavior that undermines the nation's long-term viability. Moral vanity, virtue signaling, and the pursuit of dominion. Moral vanity drives much of American political behavior, with leaders seeking to project themselves as enlightened figures through expansive claims of compassion and justice. This psychological need for status and admiration leads to performative grandstanding that prioritizes symbolic gestures over substantive preservation of the historic nation's character. Virtue signaling satisfies internal ego requirements while appealing to audiences conditioned to equate restraint with moral failing. The result is relentless interventionism that expands state authority at the expense of organic social order. This vanity intertwines with a craving for dominion over others. Politicians derive satisfaction from exercising control and eliciting respect or fear, often cloaking authoritarian impulses in benevolent language. Ego-driven motivations override considerations of liberty and self-sufficiency, producing mandates that erode personal agency and group cohesion. The unlikable and destructive nature of such leadership becomes evident in outcomes that fracture the very society's leaders claim to uplift, yet the psychological rewards of power sustain the cycle. Pomposity and self-aggrandizement further distort decision-making. Elites position themselves as superior moral arbitrators, ignoring the complexities of human nature, including innate tribal loyalties and behavioral variances. This hubris blinds them to the limits of top-down engineering, resulting in policies that punish natural instincts of self-preservation among the majority population. America's political landscape exemplifies how individual psychological needs for validation and dominance aggregate into civilizational drift. Elite self-interest, public choice, and institutional self-oppression. Public choice dynamics reveal how rational self-interest among elites produces collectively irrational outcomes for the nation. Concentrated benefits, votes, financial enrichment, bureaucratic expansion, accrue to decision-makers while diffuse costs fall upon the broader historic population. This incentive structure encourages deception and corruption, as leaders pursue personal advancement under guises of public good. Venality and opportunism characterize a ruling class that consistently prioritizes its own preservation over national continuity. State authority in America has increasingly turned inward, functioning as a mechanism of self-oppression against the founding peoples. Psychological patterns of authority acquiescence among the populace enable this inversion, where citizens defer to institutions that undermine their demographic position and cultural inheritance. Elites exploit these tendencies, manufacturing consent through ideological conditioning that equates majority self-advocacy with extremism. The result is governance that treats the historic population as an obstacle rather than the rightful stewards. This self-oppression reflects deeper group conflict realities. When leaders ignore tribal instincts and power struggles inherent to diverse societies, they erode the high-trust environments essential for prosperity. America's experience demonstrates how elite detachment, fostered by psychological distance from the consequences of their choices, produces policies hostile to the majority's survival interests. The cycle persists because each generation of mediocrities learns and replicates the dysfunctional incentives of the last. Cognitive dissonance, myth internalization, and suppressed group realities. Cognitive dissonance permeates American elite and public psychology, allowing commitment to visibly failing paradigms despite mounting evidence. Leaders and institutions maintain narratives of inevitable progress and moral triumph while suppressing recognition of eroded social trust, demographic replacement, and cultural fragmentation. This dissonance resolves through denial and projection, attributing problems to external forces rather than inherent policy flaws or human behavioral parameters. Populations internalize these myths through repeated exposure and authority deference, creating a widespread low level of critical understanding. Reverence for past figures as great visionaries persists even as their legacies deliver destruction, reflecting psychological needs for continuity and meaning. The populace becomes both victim and enabler, regurgitating ideals that justify ongoing erosion of their own group's position. This internalization blocks the natural drive toward self-determination and renewal. Group realities, innate tendencies toward kin preference, historical animosities, and differential outcomes, cannot be indefinitely suppressed without consequences. America's shift away from homogeneity has activated these dynamics, reducing cohesion and amplifying grievances. Psychological resistance to acknowledging these truths stems from conditioning that equates realism with moral defect. Overcoming this requires confronting the full spectrum of human behavior, including the legitimate instinct for peoples to maintain their homelands and continuity. Hubris, naivety, and the path to demographic self-determination. Leadership hubris in America manifests as overconfidence in the ability to remake society according to abstract ideals, disregarding evolutionary and historical lessons about human nature. Naivety about group compatibility and the limits of altruism leads to repeated interventions that destabilize the foundational framework. These traits combine with fraud and phoniness, where elites project competence and benevolence while advancing agendas that serve ego and power. The natural counterforce is the survival instinct and drive for demographic self-determination. White Americans, like other peoples, possess legitimate psychological attachments to their culture, heritage, and majority status in the lands their ancestors built. Suppression of this instinct through elite policies produces alienation and backlash. Recognition of these human universals offers a pathway out of decline, emphasizing realistic stewardship over utopian experimentation. Renewal demands rejection of pomposity and embrace of mature realism. By acknowledging the psychological roots of past failures, short-sightedness, vanity, dissonance, and inverted incentives, current generations can prioritize family formation, border integrity, merit, and cultural preservation. America's future hinges on harnessing these behavioral insights to assert continuity rather than submit to inherited patterns of self-erasure. Conclusion. The psychological and behavioral concepts evident in America's development explain the drift from foundational promise to compounded challenges. Short-sightedness, moral vanity, elite self-interest, cognitive dissonance, and suppressed group dynamics have interacted to produce self-undermining governance that threatens the historic population's continuity. These human parameters operate consistently across generations, transforming potential strength into vulnerability. Understanding these forces without illusion enables a shift toward responsible self-determination. Rejection of reverence for flawed predecessors frees society to address root causes rather than symptoms. America's experience serves as a cautionary illustration of how unchecked psychological tendencies among leaders erode civilizations, while conscious realignment with human nature offers hope for endurance and renewal. The path requires clarity about innate instincts for preservation and the costs of ignoring them. With historical perspective, the imperative becomes restoring balance between liberty, cohesion, and the natural drive of a people to secure its future. This conceptual framework illuminates both the sources of decline and the foundations for potential recovery.